Ratchet Deadlocked has always been one of the most unique games in the entire Ratchet & Clank series. It dropped a lot of the platforming and just leaned heavily into the combat side of the PS2 series. Because of that, some fans absolutely love it, and some don't even consider it a Ratchet & Clank game at all. I've also seen a ton of comments asking me to compare Deadlocked, Jack X, and Sly 4. But to be honest, these games are completely different, and they also span across different console generations, so I think it's better to review each one individually and slot it into the tier list that I made earlier. But with that being said, the real question of this video is, was Ratchet Deadlocked a good game? Now, the first thing that really stood out to me replaying this game was just how different this game feels compared to the rest of the PS2 trilogy. Instead of another galaxy jumping adventure, Ratchet & Clank are abducted and forced into a deadly television competition called Dread Zone. The entire game revolves around fighting through brutal combat arenas whilst millions of people across the galaxy watch it as entertainment. And it's a really simple premise, but I think it works really well with this type of game. Having the commentators constantly react to your matches really cement the fact that you're in a game show.
Well, here he is. He's a little guy, isn't he? Well, don't bother getting up for drinks, folks. This guy won't last 2 rounds.
I actually really liked Vox as a villain here, and I think he's a lot more interesting than a lot of people give him credit for. Unlike Ratchet & Clank 3's villain, Dr. Nefarious, who's basically just evil for the sake of being evil, Vox feels way more grounded in this universe the way that Chairman Drek did in the first Ratchet game. Everything he does is motivated by profits, ratings, and entertainment, and honestly, it fits into that corporate greed angle that fits into the Ratchet & Clank universe so well.
Ratchet breakfast cereal, earmuffs and cologne, soft drinks, hard drinks, energy drinks, breath mints. You get record deals, movie rights, reality shows, video games, and commercials.
The story itself definitely isn't the main focus here, but it does a really good job setting up the non-stop combat-focused structure that makes Deadlocked feel completely different from the rest of the series. The first thing I immediately noticed jumping into the gameplay was the fact that lock strafe is turned on by default here, whereas in the previous games it was an optional mechanic. And honestly, I think that alone tells you everything about the direction Deadlocked was going for. This game wants you constantly moving, constantly aiming, and constantly fighting. Combat isn't just one part of the experience anymore, it is the entire experience. We then get this small tutorial introducing the controls, and something I noticed also immediately, and this genuinely might be me, is how oddly stiff Ratchet looks when he runs in this game. There's something about his movement animation that feels a little different compared to the earlier games. Maybe it's because Clank isn't constantly sitting on his back, or maybe the heavier combat focus changed the animation style slightly. It's not a huge issue by any means, but if you've played the original trilogy a lot, it's one of those tiny details that you'll instantly notice. But replaying Deadlocked again makes you realize that this game basically takes the best part of Ratchet & Clank 3, the combat, and just fully doubles down on it. And because of that, I think it's kind of odd to say that you would love Ratchet 3 but completely hate Deadlocked. And whether that works for you or not really comes down to what you personally value most in a Ratchet & Clank game. But honestly, that combat-focused approach works surprisingly well here. Every world still manages to have its own distinct theme and atmosphere, even if the structure is much more arena-focused than the previous games. And because of that, this game has non-stop action where you're basically always fighting something. There's barely any platforming here, there's no real puzzle solving, and the game rarely slows down at all, which honestly is going to massively work for you or completely turn you away. Because whilst I do think the combat itself is genuinely great, this is also where the repetition starts to become noticeable. A lot of the mission structures boil down to reaching an area, destroying a specific object, surviving multiple waves of enemies, or defending something for a set amount of time. And compared to previous Ratchet games where you're constantly traveling between planets, exploring new environments, and getting new different gameplay styles thrown at you, Deadlocked feels way more repetitive structurally, which honestly is why I think this game ended up becoming so diversive within the fanbase. If you love the series mainly for the adventure, exploration, and variety, I can completely understand why Deadlocked wouldn't click for you. But if your favorite part of Ratchet & Clank up your arsenal was the combat, then I honestly think there's a lot to love here. We also get some vehicle sections sprinkled throughout the game as well to help break things up a bit. And honestly, some of these are pretty fun. My personal favorite here was the Landstalker missions. They add a little bit more scale to the combat and help give the game some variety whenever the arena structure starts feeling a bit repetitive. And when it comes to the weapons, I'll be honest, at first I was actually a little disappointed seeing that there are only 10 weapons in the the game. Compared to some of the previous Ratchet games, it definitely feels like a smaller arsenal initially. But honestly, after playing through much more of the game, I don't think it really ended up being an issue. Each weapon feels polished, distinct, and actually useful in combat, which gives the arsenal a lot more gameplay variety than I expected going into it. And straight away, we've also got 10 weapon levels this time, which gives the progression system a really satisfying sense of growth throughout the game. Watching your weapons slowly become more ridiculous and overpowered is one of the most addictive part of Ratchet and Clank. On top of that, there's also the weapon mod system, which I actually thought was a pretty cool addition, even if I personally didn't experiment with it all that much. You've got things like the ice mods that freeze enemies, acid effects, explosion rounds, and a bunch of other upgrades that let you customize weapons a little bit depending on your playstyle. It's not the deepest system ever, but it does add another layer of progression on top of the standard weapon leveling. One thing I also noticed is that I basically never struggled for bolts through my playthrough. As you complete missions to increase your dead zone ranking, the game rewards you with a ton of bolts consistently, so I felt like I was swimming in bolts for the entire game. And then there's probably the biggest new gameplay addition in Deadlocked, Merc, and Green. These two combat bots are basically your teammates throughout the game, and honestly they're way more important than I remembered. Not only do they help during combat, but certain objectives genuinely rely on them for things like hacking terminals or throwing EMP grenades. And it's definitely worth investing in their upgrades as well, because by the later parts of the game, their armor and damage output becomes surprisingly strong. They actually end up making the whole game feel a little more tactical compared to the previous Ratchet games, even if the overall focus is just pure chaos. But beyond the performance side of things, replaying Deadlocked also remind me how much charm these older Ratchet games have. There's just something about the humor, the animations, the sound effects, and even the lower fidelity PS2 graphics that give these games a ton of personality. The entire original trilogy has this slightly goofy energy to it that makes it feel incredibly memorable today. And I've been playing the Future series for the first time recently, and whilst those games obviously look much better visually, I don't think that the humor or the animations hit quite the same as they did in the PS2 era. Now, that could just be my nostalgia goggles talking, but I think there's something about the older games that really is hard to replicate. Even when the graphics are technically worse, they still have this huge amount of identity and charm to them. And I think the music is another part of that as well, because Deadlock's soundtrack fits right in with the rest of the series. It's packed with some absolute bangers. But after playing Ratchet Deadlocked in 2026, I think I understand this game a lot better than I did back in the day, because at its core, it's not really trying to be a traditional Ratchet and Clank game. It's not about exploration, it's not about hopping between planets, and it's definitely not about puzzle solving or downtime. Deadlocked is basically a full commitment to the combat from start to finish. It wants you in arenas constantly fighting, constantly upgrading, and constantly pushing through wave after wave of enemies. And when you look at it through that lens, it actually works really well. Combat is fast, the progression is addictive, and the weapons feel great to use. And by the end of the game, you really do feel like you've become completely overpowered in the best way possible. Even the smaller additions like Merc and Green, the weapon mods, and the Dread Zone ranking system all feed into that loop of just making you feel stronger and keeping you more engaged. But at the same time, I completely understand why this game is so divisive. Because if what you loved about the original trilogy was the exploration, the platforming, and the consistent sense of an adventure across different planets, then Deadlock probably feels like a step backwards. It strips away a lot in favor of a much more focused arena style experience. And that's where the real split happens for people. But for me personally though, I think there's a lot to respect here. It's a bold shift, it fully commits to its idea, and even though it sacrifices some of the charm and variety of the earlier games, it replaces that with some of the most addictive combat the series has ever seen. So is Ratchet Deadlocked a must play? I'd say yeah, but only only if you go into it understanding what it actually is. It's not trying to be Ratchet and Clank 4, it's its own thing entirely. And in terms of the tier list, I think that it's still a really good game. I don't think it's as good as Ratchet 2 and 3. I still really enjoyed the adventure and the planet hopping, so I think Ratchet Deadlocked is probably, I would say it's a low A tier for me. Not as good as Ratchet 2 and 3, but still a really good game nonetheless. But what do you guys think? Do you love Ratchet Deadlocked, or is it one of those games that just never really clicked with you? Let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.